Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Now today's video is a little bit of a special one because I'm working on the first folder I have made in over 5 years. It's also special because it's the first Damascus blade that I've made without a commission. And I decided to use a piece of 816 layer Damascus for the pattern today. And it's laddered Damascus, very lightly laddered to give a nice chatoyance. Now obviously we've used the press to flatten it out, and now we're just truing it up with the hammer to give it a nice flat plane so that we can then go to grinding with minimal material removal. And before I'm going to go to grinding, I'm obviously going to anneal it, or normalize it as slowly as possible by heating it up to critical temperature in the forge and then letting it cool down in the atmosphere. Once I've cut it off the bar, I'm going to put it into vinegar and then leave that overnight. And that's going to break down the scale, which is then going to help us when we come to grind the surface finish. If we didn't do this part, then the scale, which is much harder than the abrasive compound on the belt, would actually damage the belt, and then we would wear out our belts a lot faster. So we're going to start with the rough 60 grit belt on the 2x72 belt grinder, and then we're going to move to 180 grit on the disc sander, and then I didn't show the part where I hand sanded it to 180 grit on a surface plate as well to get it perfectly flat and parallel. So we've marked the center point for the pivot because it's easier to drill when it's in this big solid bar rather than drilling it after we've cut everything out. I will drill the holes in the spacer afterwards, but this specific hole is good for then marking off from everything else. I did originally try and cut this out with a jeweler's saw, but ended up going to the Dremel, as you can see. Because it was just a bit easier. I did finish it off with a jeweler's saw as well. And then we're going to have to grind out the shape from those rough cut profiles. So this blade is a Sardinian Risola. The specific pattern is based off the Patterson, which originally was a quote-unquote farmer's knife, peasant knife slit joint. Although most of them were friction folders, they did kind of develop into slit joints. This one's designed as a friction folder. Some of the larger Patterson were actually used as fighting knives, but you can see here that the backspacer doesn't actually act as a spring, it's just a detent for the two things. We had to shorten the blade down a little because I underestimated how much I was going to have to remove from the shoulder of the blade because I stuffed up the grinding a little bit. Trimming everything up with a file because files do everything better than a grinder when it comes to small detail work. And I decided to add some jigging, which this specific jigging pattern was inspired by Jerry Fisk, which is the jigging then interspersed between two hollowed sections, two round cut-ins. I really like the look. So once we've trued up the profile, we're then going to mark out the spacing for the spacer pins. The reason I didn't do that before I cut it out of the main bar was because I wasn't sure what the final dimension of the spacer was, and I wanted to have an accurate measurement. These are actually going below the center line, towards the belly, and the reason for that is because I want as much meat on the scales as possible. These are 1/16 inch pinholes that are eventually going to hold 1/16 inch nickel silver pins. But before we get to hardening, we're going to actually do some spine file work on this as well. I decided to do a simple round cut, triangle cut pattern, which is fairly simple but quite visually appealing. Unfortunately, it does kind of overshadow the Damascus pattern, which I left quite low contrast for this build, so something to keep in mind for future builds, I think. But now we're going to quench the blade and the spacer. I did normalize these 3 times each before this step, but I figured I didn't need to show that on camera. Nice even heat, and then straight into the preheated oil. Keeping it moving to make sure I don't get a vapor jacket. And the same deal with the spacer. The reason you harden the spacer as well is obviously because you want the Damascus to etch similarly. Now, instead of, grinding this or hand sanding it, I'm going to use a surface plate on both of them to keep them perfectly flat. You can hear my wife in the background. But, yeah, we're going to mark out our bevel lines and get to grinding. This is a full flat ground blade. And I used a 6mm drill bit to mark the center, so that I had a millimeter gap in the middle. A little jig that I made for grinding. Pretty simple, it's just pins. I think if I was to make it again, I would make it so that I could screw the pivot point to the jig. Unfortunately, I actually broke my tap trying to do that for this jig. So we go 60, 120, and then 240, and then I hand sand from 240. And took the edge quite fine from here, because it is a pocket knife. It's not a, chopper. I'm not trying to do survivalism with it. Nice fine edge is going to cut much better than a big, thick, chunky one. It was important to be very careful not to burn the edge when grinding this with the jig, because obviously my hands aren't in contact with it, so couldn't feel the heat. But then I went through the grits, started with 240, went to 400, 800, 1200, and then buffed it before etch. And then after etch, as you'll come to see. Nice straight strokes. Even if you're going to buff, a good hand sand is important. But before we get to the etch, we're going to grind the buffalo horn scales. I got these buffalo horn scales from Creative Man. And because if you watched my creating flatness videos, then you'll know that the belt grinder doesn't actually get things flat, so I used a surface plate to finish it. And the reason I do all of this before etching is because the etch is kind of the finish on the blade, and all of this moving around and using pins and drill bits and all that kind of stuff is going to potentially scratch up the finish, which I'll have to resand. Which I ended up having to, but didn't show that on camera. The reason you can see me drilling from different angles there is because the drill is not square, so I'm trying to mitigate it. And unfortunately, the super glue didn't hold up for drilling the holes, but it held it in place for at least getting that first hole, which I could then use to pin in place to mark out the rest. Normally it would hold, but it was a cheap super glue and I didn't clean the surfaces properly, so you can see it popped off here with the pressure. Same deal again, just using super glue to drill the holes, and I'm also drilling the pivot hole in the blade. Or drilling the pivot hole for the blade, I should say. So once we've got the profile marked out, we're going to grind a rough profile, or file a rough profile as I did here after jeweler's sawing. I found the jeweler's saw was faster to get this done. You could use a scroll saw. And again, this pattern is Patata Risola from Patata area of Sardinia. Really like the dropped kick handle. And actually what I'm doing here is relieving the inside of the scales for room for the blade, which is quite a traditional thing to do. And cutting and grinding the ferrule. It's just a piece of copper pipe. And once I've ground it to fit the ferrule, I'm going to actually cut the ferrule open to allow the blade to move through it. Some people like to form their ferrules over mandrels, and you can have rectangular ferrules and stuff like that. I went for a round ferrule because it's relatively traditional. It's also a little bit easier. Pays to be careful when grinding this. You know, you want to only go little bits at a time. I'm using 120 grit there. Once I've got it fit, now we go to the jeweler's saw again. One of the most useful tools in my shop, to be honest. Drilling this was massive pain. So now I'm grinding the profile of the handle to match the ferrule. You can see I'm being very careful not to touch the actual ferrule, but this is going to give me my nice shape. And I'm going to hand sand the fittings now, because basically all the fittings done, I can grind everything without the fittings or blade in it, so I'm going to do the finishing of the blade and stuff now. All of the shaping of the handles will be done with the piece apart. Going for a slightly oval, which is why you have that belly in the handle, gives it a little bit more ovalness, which means it's not going to roll in your hand, and it gives you a little bit more edge alignment. Buffalo horn is pretty easy to shape. You got to be careful not to overheat it though, because it burns quite easily and it stinks. And so I'm going to finish up the shape with a file just to make it easier. So I sanded 400, 1200, and then we're going to go to the buffer. And you can see here with nice white compound, I should say, it comes up with a nice mirror polish. etching in ferret chloride. It was 2 5-minute dunks with cleaning between, and then I buffed them. And that's going to give me a low contrast finish for the Damascus, which is something I quite liked on this. You could go for high contrast with coffee. I did consider it, but I decided a low contrast would fit this pattern a little bit better. There you go. So now the glue up. I'm using West Systems G-Flex epoxy, which I purchased from Gamico Artisan Supplies. It's the first time using it. It's very easy to use. It's a very long set time, so you've got about 40 minutes of usable work time. I used very little, and with a large bottle set like that, that's probably going to last me the rest of my career. But yeah, gluing this up took a long time and a lot of fiddly stuff because there's lots of parts. And they are all very close and tightly fit because I like no gaps in my work. The scales are actually heirloom fit to the spacer and to the ferrule, and that's to provide a little bit of visual interest. It also allows for the horn to expand and contract, which is something you need to keep in mind when using natural materials, unstabilized especially, is that with heat and moisture, they will expand and contract, and that can cause sharp ridges where it connects with other pieces, especially inorganic pieces like steel, brass, copper, that kind of thing. I don't normally advise tapping your pins in with a hammer, but I had to get these fit. I won't put the blade in, as you'll notice. Now, the filing of the pins and then sanding obviously ruins the polish, but the reason I polished before I did this step was so that I could polish the areas around the bullnosing, around the heirlooming, without having to then rebuff the steel portions as to not overbuff and wash out the Damascus. So I actually sanded the ferrule 400, then 1200, and then buffed it. And that's going to give me a nice bright mirror shine, which we're then going to heat patinate, which is a very kind of Japanese technique. It's something that I really enjoy on copper. Copper patinates naturally anyway, quite quickly, so the heat patina just speeds things up. And it helps if you use water and just cool it occasionally. I actually went back and repatinated it after this. And that's the finished patina. When fitting the pivot pin, it's stainless steel, so it's going to you know, receive wear a little bit better than, say, brass or copper, but it is a little bit more of a pain to peen and to cut. And I just showed the last bit of me cutting it with a jeweler saw. It took me a little while to do. And then we filed both ends to 1.5 times the width of the material high from the surface. And that's going to give us a substantial amount of material to then peen. Peening this was actually quite difficult because it's obviously off-center on the circle, so it's not actually in the middle of the circle. And that means that one side of the peen is actually a little bit proud of the material, and I had to work that over as to not have a sharp side of the pin. But the final result is quite nice. I'd like to thank you for watching the video. Hope you really enjoyed. I'd like to say a huge thank you to my patrons who will show on screen now. They help make this kind of content possible, including they bought me the Yeti microphone that I'm using right now to record. So if you like the video, hit that like button, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon to be notified of new videos. If you want to join my Patreon crew and help support me and get access to behind the scenes content, then the links will be down in the description below. Have a fantastic day, guys. Bye-bye.